Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is David Faber, and I want to welcome you on behalf of Tufts University and the Tufts Financial Network to our program this afternoon. By the way, if you're not familiar, I should tell you the Tufts Financial Network is an affinity group. It's for alumni, parents, friends who work in the financial services industry. It's been around for 13 years, amazingly enough, and TFN has organized an annual speaker series in New York. We've hosted summer networking events for student interns, finance professionals. We have a career forum as well. And by the way, we all hope very soon to be back in person. Perhaps this will be our final virtual programming event, although I will say one benefit to these is we get incredible guests, oftentimes people who might not have been able to make the trip, whether it's to the Tufts campus or to New York, where I am. This is our third TFN Touchpoint. It is a series that we're trying to explore some of the contemporary themes in business and finance and the global economy. Today, we're going to focus on CEO perspective of really what has been, I call it sort of the changing responsibility of both the CEO and the corporation, because it has been a particularly tumultuous time in some ways, but one that has changed a great deal, even over the last 18 months. And so we've got an incredible group to help us address some of these changes. And we're going to do that for the next hour. So let me introduce my guest today. And I'm going to start with Kristin Peck. She's the CEO of Zoetis. And for those of you who perhaps didn't know, and prior to this, we were talking about veterinary schools because she knows a lot of them. And Tufts has a great one, by the way, which I have to admit, I didn't really know as much. But if there are any vets on, welcome as well. But Kristin's with us. She leads, it's the largest leading animal health company out there. Of course, it's a member of the Fortune 500. She, of course, is on the board of directors as well. She's been with the company for quite some time, helping actually oversee its public offering in 2013. But as importantly, even in the last year or so since she took over, she has dealt with some very important challenges at the company that you wouldn't typically have imagined coming into that job. You might have. And so I'm really thrilled to have Kristin with us. I want to also introduce next. We always have to have a Tufts alum other than me. And in this case, we got a much better one. He graduated a lot way after me as well. He's a young star still. He's the chief executive of Ziff Davis, Vivek Shah. He's held that role actually since 2010. He did lead the acquisition of Ziff Davis when it was a private company. You may be a little not confused, or maybe you are. J2 Global was the name of this company until recently, but then it returned to the Ziff Davis name. Vivek, you have importantly a very young population of employees, and I think you're going to give us a great perspective, certainly as well from the technology side. Speaking of technology, I want to finally come to Meg Whitman and give me a moment here, because Meg has been a good friend for many years. And I would hope many of you out there know of the storied career of this person. But we met originally when I did a documentary on eBay. I can't even remember how many years ago. I meant to check, Meg. I think it might be 18 years ago. But whatever the number, yeah, okay. Whatever the number is, obviously you had led that company from being a very small company into a leading company, of course, in e-commerce. Then you went on to lead truly a behemoth in Hewlett, Packard, HP, hundreds of thousands of employees, a lumbering giant, I think you'll permit me to say in some ways, and one that required a great deal of attention on your part as you sort of figured out what would work best. And in many ways, that ended up being more focus for every one of the different business units, which you executed on over a fairly long, although frankly, in some ways, quick period of time. And then you moved on from there. By the way, I forgot to mention running for governor of California as the Republican nominee, something I want to come back to. And obviously your latest effort at Quibi. Meg, I always appreciated so much your willingness to come on with me, rain or shine, quarter after quarter. And we had some very difficult discussions on air. You always addressed everything candidly and were willing to address mistakes that were made, and talk about how they could be improved upon. And so I'm so thankful to you as well for joining us today. And with that, let's get started. And, you know, I want to talk, as I said, about sort of this massive change that's taken place over this last, really, let's call it 3, 4, 5 years. But first, there's something that's also on the minds of so many of our viewers, I think, many of them, again, who I said maybe early in their careers, which is, when are we getting back to the office? I, by the way, am in the office every day. And so I can apologize for this horrible Zoom background. I'm in my son's room. He's at Tufts University, so he's not here. Yeah, that's a picture of Citi Field. We're Mets fans. It's horrible. I'll leave it at that. But I do apologize. I do not have as beautiful a background as some of my panelists do. But Vivek, let me start with you. You know, what is your sense at this point? And I talk to so many CEOs about this because I know you're focused on it. You have to be. You're probably tired of discussing it, frankly, at this point. What is your expectation in terms of people returning to the office, how often they will return, and whether or not that is corresponding with what you might want as the CEO?
Well, look, I think I'd start by saying that not every company has a choice. So there are a whole range of jobs that just can't be done remotely. I think for us, we're a digital media company. So everything we do, everything we produce, everything we distribute, everything we sell is digital. So from our perspective, we do have the ability to have flexibility. And I think what the pandemic really did was accelerate a range of things we were thinking about in terms of how the company would approach work and how we would think about workplaces. So early in the pandemic, we said, look, if you want to permanently work remotely, let us know. About a third of the company, we have 5,000 employees, about a third of the company said, look, I'd like that. I want to possibly change where I live. I want to change my childcare, whatever the rationale was. And so we accepted that. So about a third of the company has done that. And I think as we get closer to understanding what the future is, I think that number may actually go up just a little bit. But I also think you've got a good chunk of our population, I think for many companies, where this notion of flexibility and hybrid work, I think is going to prevail. And so, you know, what we're trying to figure out are, what are the parameters of that? What are the conditions of that? How will that work? What I will say from a positive point of view is, look, I've seen a difference in how we recruit. So we now recruit everywhere. We view literally, we're seeing applicants from all over the world. And I wouldn't say that's what we were doing pre-pandemic. So I think we've opened the universe of people that we would look at for jobs. Internal mobility. Before the pandemic, I would try to encourage hiring managers to move people around because I feel like that's how your career develops. I've had the benefit of that in my career, and why shouldn't others? But it was hard. It was hard to get a New York role to consider someone in San Francisco, and that person likely didn't want to move. So I think we've had some really good examples of internal mobility. And then the last piece I would say is we launched an initiative called Restart. So this is individuals who have been out of the workplace at home for 2 years or more, and giving them the opportunity to come back, work with us. We do a 16-week mentorship, training, and support program with the idea that they can come back into the workplace. And most of those roles are actually remote roles. So I think that has a profound impact on individuals who may have left the workforce for childcare reasons. And now we have an opportunity to bring them back in. So look, I see the positives. At the same time, you know, it is great to be in person with people, and we try through events, and I do go into the office a couple of times a week, but I do think this is a new reality, at least for our company.
All right, so real quickly, what are your expectations then? I mean, how many days a week are people going to be in your office in New York City, do you think? Let's call it beginning Jan 1.
I think you're going to have about half of the company in 2 to 3 times a week. I say times, I don't even say days. I think it's there's going to be a level of, I think, flexibility even with respect to that. I don't see many coming in 5 days a week, though there are those who have circumstances at home, by the way, that necessitate coming to a place that's just more comfortable and equipped. But that's generally my sense. But again, it is really a universe of coders and programmers, content creators, many of whom text-based content. So it's a particular workforce.
Sure, understood. Yeah, Kristin, your workforce is obviously quite different. I mean, you're in your office right now, we should point out, and I assume there are some other people there with you. But obviously you also have people who have to work 5 days a week because they're making something somewhere. And, you know, how are you dealing with it both there? I assume they've been in pretty much throughout. And what's been your approach in terms of your office, people who work in your offices?
Yeah, and I think you started also with a great question, which is, you know, what's our goal? And similar to Vivek, our goal is, first of all, our colleagues feel safe and are safe, that their well-being, and that's a definite new dimension that I think as CEOs and as leaders, you have to think about is what's the well-being of your colleagues. And then productivity. And we've had some of the best years of the company ever during the pandemic. So there's no question that for our office-based colleagues, they can be productive at home. As you said, you know, we've got about half our colleagues who are, you know, physical presence required. They're manufacturing vaccines or diagnostics. They're working in R&D labs. They're caring for, you know, animals. They have to be in person. So it is a balance. And I think when you look at this topic, we talk often about what it means in office-based workers. And our policy there is around empowered flexibility. I agree with Vivek. It'll probably be colleagues coming in. We expect colleagues with that to come into the office on a regular basis. That is based on your job, your team, what you're doing, what your needs are that week or that month. You know, when do you need to collaborate? Are you apprenticing a new person? We think that's probably, again, not a full day necessarily always, but 2 to 3 times a week for a lot of our colleagues. But it could be one. And we were also doing what Vivek said, some roles did go remote. But I'd say for our office-based colleagues, we think it will matter. But I don't know whether it's going to be consistent across different teams, how many days a week that is and how often. And, you know, I'm in the office about 3 days a week right now, but my job, I travel, as you know, we're a global company, so I'm on the road a decent amount. But I do think, you know, we have to be flexible. This is going to evolve over time. I think whatever we think it's going to be now, we're going to try it out. I mean, our offices are open if you're vaccinated, and we have at best 100 out of the 500 that are here on any given day these days. So we're definitely not at 50% capacity by any stretch. And I think we just as leaders have to let it evolve. I think there's still families figuring out childcare situations. And I think what we're not talking as leaders enough about is what you do with your overtime eligible colleagues to give them flexibility, because that is the frustration amongst our workforce. For colleagues who have to be physically present, how do we give them flexibility? Because they feel like a lot of us got it and they didn't. And so we're working really hard to figure out ways within our manufacturing and other organizations to allow them some flexibility. Because if not, if it only becomes your office-based workers, it does, you know, become sort of unfair. And it is a challenge for us in the sense of recruiting colleagues too.
Yeah. Meg, I'd love to get your perspective as well, particularly as somebody obviously who worked in Silicon Valley for as long as you did. And yet I would assume also came to the office pretty much every day unless you were traveling. It wasn't like you were working from home somewhere, Zooming with people. You know, I find myself a bit anachronistic, I guess, in the expectation somehow at the outset of this that everybody was going to come back 5 days a week. Clearly, time and again, you hear what we just heard. That's not going to happen. But what do you see sort of evolving from your perspective?
Well, listen, I agree with both Vivek and Kristin. There's been real positives and some negatives as well. The reason I think we will have more people come back to work than maybe we think right now is the most important people who I think are being hurt by Zoom and by being away from the office are young executives. Because how did we learn? We learned by watching. We learned by hanging around with people. We learned by going on business trips with people. We learned from our leaders who would say something after a customer meeting. And I think there is a whole generation of young executives who are not getting that, if you will, on the job in-person training. And my view is, I think over time you will end up with certainly 3, probably 4. And I think maybe in, several years when the sort of pandemic has receded in our memory, I think we may be back 5 out of 5 days. We'll see.
You do? You really think we could be back 5 out of 5?
I do, because I think, listen, Zoom is great for communications. My experience, and it might be because, I'm at really the end of my career, not the beginning. My experience is it's not great for problem solving, right? It's not great for problem solving. It doesn't allow, I don't think, everyone to contribute fully. There's not that give and take. There's not the coffee room, aha. So I think, after this pandemic fades a bit, I think we may be back 5 out of 5. We'll see. We'll see.
Vivek, I wanted to and believe similarly to what Meg is saying, although I have to admit, being a reporter, I sort of listen to everybody I'm talking to, and nobody seems to, or few people, I should say, seem to expect that. Even those CEOs who have asked for their employees to be back 5 days a week by right now are losing that battle. I've talked to a number of them on Fridays, and they're like, I'm the only person here. Clearly, it doesn't matter. And I wonder, particularly amongst the younger generation out there that's just new to the workforce, it does seem as though it's just not even a question to them as to whether they're ever going to come 5 days a week. That's not going to happen. But I'd love to get your perspective on that.
Well, and something Meg said did strike me, which is right now we're all similarly situated. We each have a box, and that works. I remember when prior to the pandemic, we used Zoom a lot. We used it because we were a distributed company. And it would drive me nuts where maybe I'm in a box and then there are 15 people in a room in a box. And that doesn't work as well. And so, it was getting to the point where I would ask people in an office, you know what, maybe you go back to your workstation so we each have a box and there's a smoother communication. So there are things that will present themselves, I think, as things start to evolve that we're going to have to think through. And I think while the current sentiment amongst many workers is what you're saying, David, which is no way, no how, I love this flexibility, I think that will evolve too. I think pendulums swing. We have a tendency to over and underestimate at various moments in time on lots of things. I go back to, I just think that there will be more flexibility. I just remember prior to this, all of the hand wringing around, how do you get to when someone gets to, work from home on one day, and what are those requirements, and what's the fairness around all of that? I think a lot of those questions kind of go away. And again, I think it's role dependent. I think it's company dependent. I think it's geographically dependent. I think it's socioeconomic. There's a lot of factors here. So I don't think there is one answer. I simply think that there are more answers that are now available to us as leaders of companies. And that's how I look at it. What I'm trying not to do is force an issue right now. It's a really competitive job market, particularly in the technology internet business. And it is hard, I think, for any of those companies to get in front of other companies right now and insist on a rule that may make it hard for you to retain and attract employees.
Right. Kristin, what about that? Is it a recruiting tool in a sense to offer flexibility for certain jobs in particular?
It definitely has been for us. I also think it's really helped us to require more to both retain as well as attract more diverse talent, to be honest with you. Our where we can recruit it from has changed dramatically. And because our policy has been empowered flexibility, in other words, you decide, you and your manager, what works for you and your team and your role, and we're not dictating what that looks like, it has been very compelling. And we've gotten a lot of people who just don't want to do that commute every day or don't want to do a certain time. It's been quite helpful for us. And I can't agree with Vivek more. The war for talent is very real, and companies have to think more broadly about their value proposition and about what you're going to provide, the well-being. And I think expectations, certainly of younger generations, have changed. I mean, we do these trainings on what it means and how to have that conversation with your manager. And one of the first pieces of feedback we got was, well, why am I coming back at all? And I think to Meg's point, it's an interesting dialogue to explain why that matters, and that apprenticeship matters, collaboration matters, problem solving matters. Connectedness. My bigger concern is you're going to see turnover increase dramatically. I don't know that you get to the connectedness on Zoom. It's productive. I can't argue that. And that's why I think it's offering flexibility that different weeks and different jobs can be different. But I think the connectedness is going to be really important. And I just don't think you build those same bonds. And I think the fear of increased attrition, if we say fully remote, we have, 1,000 colleagues we've hired in the last 2 years have never been to an office. And I'm really concerned about their ability to really understand the culture more deeply and have relationships and know who to call when something comes up.
Those 1,000 people, Kristin, so you may never have met them, and or they've never met any of their colleagues. Is that possible? Or
Well, I'm meeting, some of the people that I hired, at senior leadership levels over the last year, and the last, few weeks and last month or so since we opened, I'm meeting them for the first time in person. Now I see them on Zoom all the time, and I always joke, I don't know how you feel, but some people are either taller or shorter than I'm expecting when I meet them in person. Like, they have legs. Who knew?
I get the believe me, being on TV for all these years, I get the you're shorter than I thought all the time, but. Meg, I'll leave you with the last word on this, and then I want to move on and actually ask you something else. But, in particular, I do wonder myself, this idea of connectedness that is missing, that was so important to our development, of course, during our careers, not to mention sort of a mental health perspective. I'm just curious as to what your thoughts are. Obviously, you also have two relatively younger people, children in the workforce as well at this point.
Yeah, I'm having a little internet connectivity problems, David. Can you just say that again real quick? Sorry, yeah, I lost internet briefly.
Do you have me now?
I'm in Montana, so you never know here.
Yeah, I know. Can you hear me now, Meg?
Yeah, I have you now. Yep, go ahead.
Okay. Here's another thing that doesn't happen typically when two people are together in a room.
Oh, no, I don't.
Yeah.
Hang on, let me turn off video here for a sec to see if I get a little bit more connectivity. Go ahead and ask me the question again. I'll come back on in a minute.
Okay, I was just, wanted your perspective on it to sort of wrap up this part of the conversation before we move on, particularly from as well, kind of a mental health perspective, because Kristin mentioned the lack of connectedness.
So listen, I think connectivity is crucial, just like Kristin said, the connectivity, I think it's more fun to be together, frankly. I think there's more esprit de corps. I think there's more feeling of a team. I think it's very difficult. I think the people who've had the most difficulty are people who signed on to a new company during the pandemic, and they never met people, like Kristin said. So I think it's I just think that people ultimately are going to realize that there's some really great things about being together. And my sense, as I said before, as the pandemic minds, and, here's the other thing, David, what about, you wonder whether young people who come to the office are going to get promoted faster than young people who don't come to the office? Because they're seeing the boss and things like that. And you wonder what that will do over time as well.
Yeah, I do as well. All right, we've spent a lot of time in this. I want to move on to sort of what I imagine would be our main topic. And Meg, I'm going to come back to you as well, hoping that your connectivity is working. Because, Vivek and Kristin as CEOs are dealing with things, perhaps I think neither one of them, and decisions that neither one of them might have imagined they would have to be making even only a few years ago. But you, Meg, may have set this trend in a way by making a decision in 2016. It might have even been in 15, but I think it was 16. As a longtime Republican, of course, the nominee for governor of California, the Republican nominee, nonetheless to support Hillary Clinton in an election. Not all your employees and your customers were Democrats, and so I wondered what were the conditions under which you felt it was imperative to actually participate in the public dialogue as the CEO of HP at that point, and whether you look back on that as a good decision.
Yeah, I do. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me okay? Yeah. So listen, here's my view on this. I think there has been remarkable change in the last 20 to 30 years in what's expected from companies and CEOs, and frankly, what's appropriate for companies and CEOs. And so I think, think about what's happened. There's been tremendous, I think, credibility lost among some of our traditional institutions. And whether that's, the clergy or the fraternal organizations or Boy Scouts or whatever it happens to be. And so people, I think society and people are expecting more from companies, for the most part, who they still trust, and from CEOs who are the representative of those companies. And so when it came down to it for me, and I have probably a slightly different angle on this because I ran for public office, David. So I perhaps have more legitimacy to actually make a point on who I want to support for president, because people are not surprised because I was a politician, and an unsuccessful one, let me say. But I just felt like in some ways, taking a stand on issues is about the character of the company. Howard Schultz, who was my early board member at eBay, when we faced a very knotty question about whether to sell Nazi memorabilia, alcohol, firearms, tobacco, he said, Meg, I understand this has been largely a libertarian-based company. You know, if it's legal for sale in the United States or whatever country we're doing business in, it should be legal for sale on eBay. And he said, but actually, I want you to think about the character of the company. What kind of company do you want to run? And ultimately, we made the decision to ban alcohol, firearm, tobacco. We went after fraudsters, you know, very aggressively. And I think that's kind of what's expected. So it's a little bit of the personality of the CEO, the kind of company that CEO and the board wants to run. And then, you know, is there a gap now that needs to be filled that maybe other organizations filled in the past? So I think CEOs need to be, you know, quite forthcoming about taking a stand on issues that they and their employees care about. It's fraught. Listen, I've got a couple of examples we can talk about. You know, Ken Chenault and Ken Frazier on the Voting Rights Act. Remember when Georgia announced their quite restrictive voting laws? They got 72 Black executives to sign a statement. They wanted a lot of Fortune 500 companies to sign. Many did, but many did not because they feared a boycott. And guess what? Donald Trump called for a boycott of every company that signed the support of the Ken Chenault, Ken Frazier. You know, this thing is, the law is undemocratic and it's un-American. So it's fraught. It's difficult to know what the right thing to do is. I think probably more CEOs than they otherwise did. Well, certainly when I started, when I took my first CEO job 30 years ago, like we didn't say anything to anyone. Like the whole point was don't get involved in anything that doesn't have exactly what to do with your business. I think it's changed pretty dramatically.
Yeah. Well, Kristin, I'd love you to bring it up to the, you know, us up to date on, I mean, you must be faced with decisions all the time in terms of your employees perhaps want you to participate and, or I should say, voice some sort of support, whether it is, as Meg said, voting rights or abortion rights, or there's a long list here. How do you go about deciding, Kristin, what is the right thing to engage on? And to Meg's point, when maybe you don't sign on to something because, I mean, there's money at stake here one way or the other.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely changed. There's an expectation that you're going to engage on a broad range of topics. The way I've thought about it and the way my leadership team thinks about it is, first and foremost, we're an incredibly purpose-driven company, and we have a very strong set of core values that we live by. And the first thing is this issue aligned? Is taking a position on this issue aligned with our purpose as a company? Does it help, you know, what we believe in and what we do as a business and what our purpose is? And is it aligned with our values? I think the second real question, and I think Meg was getting a little bit of this, is do I have an authentic voice in conversation? You know, I think that really matters. Does me saying something sound what my employees would expect, what my customers would expect? I think Meg talked about having an authentic voice as someone who had, you know, been a politician. And I think, you know, once you get past that, you know, you also then have to say, does taking a position have an impact? Is it going to have by me doing this, am I going to change, you know, the issue? And I think as you and I talked before, you know, there's things that we plan on doing in this space. In other words, you know, we're going to take a position on this issue or we're choosing not to. And by the way, whether you do or whether you don't, there are implications. There is no not taking a position, because not taking a position is a position. And so as a leadership team, you really have to have a discussion and decide how you're going to approach it. Because, you know, those who, you know, signed on to, you know, Ken's, you know, proposal got heat, and those who didn't also got heat from others. And, you know, the one example I would use for us was something I didn't think I was taking a position on, and yet which was for LGBTQ month, we changed our colors on all of our brands and all of our social media, which we didn't think was a big deal. However, you know, we had a very swift and very mixed reaction to that decision. Obviously, many colleagues and many of our customers were very excited, but we had other customers who were quite angry and pulled their business right away. And it was overnight. It was very fast. And so I think as a CEO, you do need to be, I think that what's most important as a senior leader or CEO is to be intentional, to know what you're deciding and be really clear why you're deciding it. Because even as I said, even when you don't think you're really making a controversial decision, it's a highly polarizing environment we work in. And no matter what you do, there's going to be people happy or people who are not. And you got to go back to, this is our purpose. These are our core values. This is why we are taking a position on this issue. And, you know, accept that not everyone's going to love it, colleague, customer, or other stakeholder.
Kristin, when you think about those stakeholders, which we now talk about in that way, is there one voice that takes prominence over any others in terms of how you do view making a particular decision as to whether to engage or not?
For us, we start with colleagues, and that's just where we always start. I've said you've never had a happy customer if you didn't have an engaged colleague, because they're the ones who establish our culture, establish our purpose, make our products. And so I think, again, you're not going to please everybody, but would my colleagues say this is aligned with my core values? And would my customers expect that as a company, Zoetis would be taking a position here? And that's really how we do it and focus on it. And so before we make some of these important decisions, we actually speak to our key colleagues, our senior leaders who represent some of these groups, to get their input. I mean, I think you need to know, is this going to be expected? How will they react? Is this worded the way they would want it worded? Or are we not going to take a position, and do I want to check with them and make sure they understand our thinking? Because when you do or don't, you need to make sure your colleagues understand and your customers understand why you are.
Yeah. Vivek, I'd love to get your thoughts as well. Particularly, I don't know what the average age of your typical employee is, but maybe fairly young. And I wonder whether that colors in terms of your discretion when you, again, choose to sort of engage in a way, again, folks, that CEOs never would have, as Meg said, never would have even thought about doing even 5 years ago.
No, I mean, I started in this role about 4 years ago, and I even detect a change in that short a window of time. So look, I think, as has been said, I think the expectation of corporations today is that you create financial and social value. That is an expectation. And the financial piece, I think, is clear to people from a shareholder value creation, particularly as a public company. How you create social value is, I think, what we're trying to figure out. For us, we have a rubric, we call it 5 pillars of purpose, and we've been very clear as an organization. We've developed, here are the 5 areas where we're trying to create value, where we're really focused on actions and activity more than probably statements. And we've had a lot of progress, and there's a clarity, right? So people understand how they map to those pillars. I suspect over time, there'll always be discussion as, are those still the right pillars, and how will that evolve? But I do also, you picked up on the employee stakeholder group. While I believe the employees absolutely want purpose matters to them as much as profits, what I've also observed in the investment community is far more attention paid to what they'll refer to as ESG. It fits into the same rubric. And I think I mentioned this to you. We did a non-deal roadshow just on ESG. And what I said to the shareholders is, look, I'm not going to answer questions about financial performance and product and business. I want to talk to you about what we're doing, because you're indicating to me a seriousness about it. We're taking it seriously. And it was incredibly well attended, great questions. And it's early days, because what's happening in the investment community is we don't have standards. You have SASB, TCFD, you have Sustainalytics, you have MSCI rating. It's all over the place. It is very early. They can't make heads or tails of it. So I think we've got a responsibility to say, look, step back from all of this. Here are the actual activities. Here are the things we're doing. Here's what we're trying to achieve. No different than I would outline our business strategies and our business priorities. And so I've been encouraged. I think the investment community wants it. And I think what you're going to see is both active and passive investors. You might see it quicker on the passive side, meaning indexers, really start to push screens where they're screening companies in and out based on ESG. So if you're looking for a practical reason, and one that ties back to shareholder value creation, I think there are a variety of other reasons why we pursue purpose, but there's a straight line there. And that, I think, is helpful as companies and CEOs think about what their agendas really should be.
Yeah. I want to spend a good amount of time on ESG if we can, but it's funny because I tend to focus on that, Meg, and diversity and inclusion. I perhaps don't talk about as much on air or during panels. And so I'd love to come to you with some perspective. As a longtime female executive, I would assume you have been on boards where perhaps you were the only woman. You've been in boardrooms or meetings where you're the only woman. And what is your perspective in terms of the evolution of diversity and inclusion as it currently stands now in corporate America versus what you've seen, during your long career? You're muted.
Diversity and inclusion was always on my radar screen, probably because I was a female CEO, right? I mean, you have to remember, I think I might have been one of 2 Fortune 500 female CEOs when I started. So a long time ago. But of course, I think what happened with the murder of George Floyd, a year ago last summer, everything changed. And I think it wasn't only corporate America. I happened to be chairman of Teach for America, and this shook Teach for America to its core. I sit on the board of Procter and Gamble and General Motors, and everyone and I was still at Quibi at that point. This captured everyone's attention in a way that I hadn't seen it quite captured in the previous, 5 to 10 years. So this is at the top of everyone's list, every boardroom discussion, every senior leadership team. Back to the Rooney Rule. Do you remember, if you're hiring for an executive position, you've got to interview people of color, you've got to interview women. And frankly, I think that's a good thing. I do think it's a good thing. And, but it is definitely at the top of everyone's list. And I think people are expected to speak out on that. Back to your original question, I think people are expected to speak out on this issue. ESG may be the next big thing. David, you must see this, from your show every week. I mean, this is the hot topic as well. I mean, look at, was it Engine 2 or Engine 72 and what they did with Exxon?
Engine 1.
I mean, that
Engine
was
1,
shocking,
Meg. Yeah,
right?
Engine 1 with ExxonMobil.
Engine 1,
yeah.
sorry,
Yeah.
Engine 2, Engine 1, whatever.
It's a little engine that could. That's what they were, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it was shocking. It was amazing. And so I think this is going to be a very important thing for, the foreseeable future. But DEI now has a whole different level of importance, and probably appropriately so. I would say not probably, definitely appropriately so, in today's world.
Kristin, I'd love to come to you on that, specific to what you did and what changes have occurred from your perch since the murder of George Floyd in particular.
I think it has changed dramatically. I will say when I was a senior leader, I would go to conferences at Fortune's Most Powerful Women and watch Meg and, be in awe. You need, leaders to look up to. I think that's, is trending nicely. George Floyd changed everything. It wasn't just, I just like some people aspire to, where are we? And I think what changed is just a realization that we had to hold people accountable. There's been efforts historically and people had a lot of talk and they might have even put money places and invested in things, but they were never held accountable for the results of what it was. I had taken over as CEO only about 6 months before that. And I had said diversity, equity, inclusion is one of my key strategies. I had planned on putting metrics out, but had I gotten it done? No, I'd like to blame COVID a little bit for that. But the reality was we hadn't. It's amazing how fast we did it once we decided it mattered. Once we decided we wanted to be held accountable and we were going to be transparent. And we very quickly, a month or two after, put out what our metrics were, where we stood on every diversity dimension. And we put targets out. And we now, every year, we put out our second report, measure our progress against those. And I think what's really changed is it's not enough to just say, I care. Your colleagues, your customers, and very importantly, and I think I agree with Vivek completely, it's changed investors' expectations that you're going to be held accountable. You're going to have to be transparent, and I'm going to hold you accountable for that. And I think that's why I agree with Meg. It has changed dramatically. It is not just, we're going to see a few people. I see a few more women, and then we've made success. It's, well, really, what's your pipeline and how many, and are you promoting at the same rates? And where are you on Blacks and Latinx? It's a new game, and the transparency and accountability is here to stay.
That was my question. Is it here to stay? I tend towards cynicism occasionally. I call it skepticism, but I've been doing this a long time. There's a reason for it. What makes you believe that this time is different than perhaps previous efforts that certainly may not have had quite as much fervor, but nonetheless seemed to have fizzled out when it came to really staying power in terms of pursuing this issue?
Well, from my perspective, it's that it's tied into this broader focus around ESG, and investors investors care and they're asking companies questions. I mean, as you know, I sit on the board of BlackRock, and the flows of money into sustainable investing vehicles and the expectation, therefore, for companies to answer these questions. You can't there's no way you're going to investor meetings with some of your top 10 shareholders and they're not asking these questions and pushing you. What are your metrics? What are your targets? Are you making progress? I mean, I was the first, Zoetis was the first in our whole industry to put out a report on all these metrics. And I'm still getting pushed by my investors. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm the only one out who's actually told you where I stand, told you where I'm going, but they want more ambitious metrics and they want more of them. I mean, we're against TCFD. And so I just think you're not going to have a choice as a company. If you're a large company with, you know, a diversified investor base, certainly in index funds, they're going to come at you with these large sustainable investing vehicles across the board in investment management. You have to answer the question. And so it's, you know, maybe you have another year to say you're working on it, but you're running out of time for I'm still working on it.
David, the other thing I'd say is this cohort of workers today are very, very focused on this. More so, I think, maybe than my generation when I came out of business school in 1979. So Kristin's right. It's coming from investors, but frankly, I think it's coming from the broader workforce.
Yeah. Vivek, do you sense that as well? Does your workforce sort of expect and even demand that the changes that you need to obviously continue to change, and or, I mean, for your company, you know, being carbon neutral may not be as difficult as it is for ExxonMobil or even any company that might have sort of an industrial output of some kind.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, you know, one of the things I'd say, just one of the distinctions, I think, between when we talk about George Floyd and the aftermath of his murder, we went from not just DEI, but to anti-racism, which is actually a related but different concept. And so I think that's where you've seen a lot of corporations step up, and what role can they play as anti-racist organizations? From a DEI point of view, you know, the table stakes are reporting, really clear reporting. I'm still surprised how many companies don't have clear diversity reporting around representation at every level, around pay equity. It is surprising to me. You know, we really focus because we have editorial platforms, we have websites that have the opportunity to provide voice to communities of color, to all genders. And so using our platforms in that way to provide voice, I think, is a really important consideration. And David, you know this, newsrooms, broadly speaking, are not very diverse. They're interestingly very progressive in thought, but frankly, not terribly diverse. And you can look across a lot of newsrooms, you know, and you can see that. So, you know, providing platforms, I think, are important. And then, you know, I do think that where we're going with just more broadly ESG, where again, the S is largely DEI in focus, right? Is I think we're going from disclosures, which feel like lots of documents that are put up on everyone's websites and fed into these ESG rating apparatus, but to real action. And I think that's the other thing, is that I think companies should also be careful that they're not making statements that they can't back up with actual action. That you know, they should view these disclosures in the same way that we view financial disclosures. That level of clarity and commitment. So I think those are there. Your original questions around the employees, they're just a source of inspiration for me. So they you know, really do, I wouldn't even say, but they just celebrate what we do. It's in that way, I think everyone just feels great about who they work with and who they work for. And there's a real camaraderie around it. And that, you know, that's special too. So I'll say that, you know, I probably grew up more in a, you know, sort of a financial orientation. The corporation's role is shareholder value creation. Don't dip into those issues. You don't have the expertise. That's how I was trained. And I like this world better, frankly. I find it's more fulfilling for me personally and for the people with whom I work.
Well, Kristin, I want to come to you on that. A bit of housekeeping here, by the way. Everybody out there, feel free to submit some questions in the Q&A function. I failed to indicate that earlier. I will try to get to them. We have about 15 minutes left with our panelists, and I certainly will try to get to some of those questions. But Kristin, let me come to you on something that Vivek just brought up, which is, I mean, I grew up as well in a world where shareholder returns were paramount. That, you know, creating shareholder value, that was your role as a CEO. Everything else was a distraction. And I wonder, or is what I'm hearing you discuss right now, should it be viewed as something that will be additive to that ultimate goal, or it doesn't really matter? It's part of my responsibility now as a CEO, even if it actually takes away from ultimate shareholder return.
I mean, I was trained very much the way Vivek was. I came out of finance and private equity. So you know, it was all about the bottom line. I think what I didn't appreciate back then is and maybe that's because, my, horizon when I was in private equity was, get my money back and my returns in 5 to 7 years. It's actually, I don't think it conflicts. I think creating societal value is in the long-term interest of companies. And I guess my perspective over time as I became a more senior leader was investing for the long term of the company. You have to be investing in societal value. And I think it's a fallacy that it really is a trade-off in the medium to long term. It can be in the short term for sure. Some of the decisions we make are the best long-term decision. You can look at decisions that CVS made around selling cigarettes, which might have been a hit in the short term, but did wonders for them and setting themselves up for the long term. But I just look at, the issue, and I don't think it is a trade-off, honestly. I think you're going to have more lasting power. You're going to have greater ability to attract talent, to engage your customers. I agree with Vivek, our colleagues and our customers want to do business with companies that share their values. So I think, maybe in a very short-term focus, is it a trade-off? But I really believe it is in the best interest of your shareholders to be investing in, being a good partner to your communities and doing the right thing. I think it always pays off in the long term. And I think, but all of us, the CEOs and senior leaders, should have more of a long-term focus for your companies. And I think when you do, it's really not the trade-off that some people think it is.
Yeah, but it's a seismic change. I mean, I don't remember.
It wasn't the way I was raised.
Yeah, for all of us.
But maybe I was too junior to see it, but I didn't. That wasn't when I was in private equity. Never occurred to me.
No, and that Business Roundtable statement of a couple of years ago at this point, where they made that change, talked about stakeholder capitalism, was a moment. Many of us actually viewed it as, well, that's just a piece of paper. But it does seem to be, Kristin, being put into effect in part. And you have a perspective on this as a BlackRock board member, as you said, because the money is moving there. And that speaks louder than anything. But I wonder, when it comes to the metrics that we need to evaluate, whether it's to evaluate Zoetis in terms of whether you're meeting your goals, or how you rank in terms of all the different aspirations you have for your carbon footprint, or whether it actually is you trying to evaluate some of your vendors as well. Are we there? Can we effectively, from either an investment standpoint or any other perspective, effectively decide who's doing well and who's not?
I think it's early, to be honest with you. I think what we expect of our vendors, and I think what investors should expect of companies is, do you have a plan? What matters to you? Where can you impact these issues? What are you doing? And how are you going to hold yourself accountable? And then that is industry specific. So if you're, a purely service business, your carbon emissions might not be it. I actually have to manufacture things. So I have a slightly different, and yet I'm not quite Exxon. So I don't think there are common metrics you can apply across the board. And so it is more nuanced. But I think it starts with, do you care? Do you have a plan? Are you measuring it? And where are you trying to go? And what's your progress? And I think that's the expectation today. There's not common metrics. That's what I think is challenging about it, but I don't think that means that it's not going to be expected. And I think that's, if you look at the money that's flowing and it's pensions, I mean, large government pensions are really moving in this space, and they're influencing how companies should think about it. When we sit down with our investors, understanding how my investors are looking at it, but it's also how my customers are looking at it and what their expectations are really important, because they're not always the same, and it's evolving. I don't think we've figured it out, or that the metrics today will be the metrics that will necessarily stay.
I want to get to a few specific questions that we've gotten from our participants here. Meg, I'll start with you. This question is actually from a fellow Princetonian. It's a great school, not quite Tufts, of course, but No,
not quite.
She's actually, I think she's class of 82 at Princeton. She said she gave a great talk several years ago at the She Roars. It's a conference. It was gathering Princeton alums. And you talked then about joining corporate boards. I asked you about it because, of course, there were times when I'm sure you were alone in a room in that regard. Can you share some practical advice for women who are interested in joining corporate boards? And by the way, Kristin, that also question could easily go to you as well.
Yeah. Well, listen, I think the first thing is, whatever your career is, make sure that you are doing the very best job you can do to rise to a level in the organization where you would be considered for a board. And by the way, I think the days of boards with only CEOs are over. It used to be that if you were on a board, you needed to be a CEO. You only wanted sitting CEOs or retired CEOs. That's not true today anymore. You want domain expertise in different areas. But I think job one is do very well in your organization so you're in a position. And then, this is another big change, David. There's a lot of networking organizations now for women. Forbes does one. There's, a whole host of networking organizations where people are looking for women. And then, frankly, if you're interested in going to Europe, there's now a big move afoot to have 50% women, not only in the United States, but also in Europe. And so I think there's a whole lot more opportunities. And the best advice I have is connect to the right headhunters, the right executive search firms, work your network, because that's how most of these board positions are still fulfilled, frankly, I think. And then, you can start, once you get on one, by the way, then your name gets into the ether, and one becomes two becomes three. So that would be my advice. And by the way, I'm, super happy to help people, who are looking for ways to get connected into a network.
Kristin, how many women do you have on your board?
I think we have 4.
You got 4 of how many people?
Of 11.
All right. So you're not at 50%. Would you like to be? Does it matter?
Sure, I'd like to be. But I would say, to me, getting past 2 to 3, I think, is the key for boards. I think 2 doesn't, you need at least 3 is sort of my view when you think about a board. I just think diversity of thought matters dramatically. I think at a group feeling that they can speak up, I'm quite fortunate that, I have the same situation on the board that I'm on. It does matter. And I think having more, having at least, I would say, 4 women on a board, it starts to really change the dynamic of that conversation. But I think Meg's advice on how to get on a board is dead on. I don't think I can even build off of it. It's exactly what I would say.
Okay.
What's interesting, David? I was surprised because I was recently joined the General Motors board, and I tipped the board to be more than 50% women. And I thought there might be a few notices of this. It's been everywhere. I mean, actually, the news cycle around that, it continues to this very day, which was surprising to me because it's the first Fortune, I think it's the first, big company, Fortune 500 board that has more than 50% women. It was just interesting to see how much notice was taken of that.
Yeah, and obviously a female CEO in Mary Barra. Yeah. Vivek, we got a question for you, and it actually goes back to our original conversation when we began. And each of you might want to address this, because we did talk about what is a war for talent, but we also seem to have going on at the same time what some people are calling a great resignation. People just dropping out of the workforce, making different decisions about, I guess, their life. I don't know if you have any perspective on that, but I assume you do.
Yeah, look, I mean, it's real. So I don't think it's made up. And it's probably a consequence of, I think we, over the last 18 months or so, a lot of expenses we normally might have in our lives didn't appear. And so people have a little bit of a cushion. And so I think there's a feeling of, let me take some time. And that this job market is really hot. And so I'll come back in and I'm not going to suffer from an interruption. Again, when I was coming up, I couldn't even conceive of stopping the momentum. Like it just, it felt to me that would have been a catastrophic choice, but things have changed a lot. I also, and I also think that I think you've got younger workers who are reprioritizing a little bit, again, I wouldn't have done a gap year, back when, I was that age. So I don't think of these things as permanent. I understand them. And I think that what we've said to folks who, it's not so much that they're leaving the company, but they're leaving office work or work is we're here. We're not going anywhere. When you want to come back, we want you to come back to us. What we have been able to do, back to the earlier conversation, is when you say, well, why do you want to do this? It's actually, they want to move to a place and didn't really understand that we would allow them to keep their wage in that place and they can have it both ways. And so we've been able to retain some people that way. But look, I think this is a tough market to compete for talent right now. I will say that. And so, it does connect to where we started, which is, I think we just have to be flexible in our ability to attract and retain talent.
Yeah, well, Kristin, you mentioned it a bit. I think you and I talked about it as well as we prepared for this panel, but attrition is up, isn't it? You are seeing, and again, that just makes life more difficult if you're having to hire and train new people all the time.
Yeah, no, it's definitely challenging. And for us, we're just seeing much more of it in our overtime eligible colleagues, which is what you're hearing everywhere. The competition for talent at that level is just, robust. And, what's important to them is sometimes different, to be honest. When you're, is it $1 more an hour? We offer phenomenal benefits and, we'll pay for your college, we'll pay for your GED. We actually do loan repayment for if you did go to school. But they don't sometimes value that. At first, they're like, oh, but I can make $1 more an hour. And so it is a different, I think people are making different choices for slightly different reasons. And then there's a lot of, two working couples saying one, given the situation with their children and COVID and whatever, that one's not going to work for a while. And I think the stats say they are sitting on the cash that Vivek says. And so we have to be as, compelling a value proposition and be as flexible as we can to retain them. But I think the way Vivek put it is perfect. We'll be here, should you choose to come back, and we're really hoping you don't go. But it's to be an HR professional today has got to be, in my view, the hardest job at our company for sure. Figuring out how to attract, retain, and update your benefits on like seemingly a weekly basis. I mean, I say my entire HR team is just phenomenal.
Yeah. Well, earlier though, we also talked about a lack of connectedness given Zoom. And given how many people are still working remotely, do you think that contributes at all to the sense of people signing off entirely?
I do, but the funny thing is they want the flexibility, and so it is funny because I've got to be careful. I don't consider myself an old person, although I think most people do consider me an old person now. And I say this because like my generation says that, and the new generation looks at me like I have 20 heads, but our turnover is really in the younger generations. It's not in the older generations who have the relationships and things like that. So I think it's a matter of an evolution for us old people and for the new generation to understand the value of some of that connectedness, but it's being flexible. I mean, the conversations, even if you look at boards or CEOs, we're all like, why are they all coming back? And they're like, why am I coming in at all? It's a very funny, different conversation. So
Meg, if Kristin considers herself old, I'm not quite sure what that means for you and me. We Meg, I'll just come to you sort of to try and sum up for us some of the things, given, again, your long perspective, the varied career that you've had, because I guess I'm so happy that you all address these things, but we're at a particular moment, and having covered business for 35 years now, I think I can say this, that is unique, that seems to be seminal, and that we may look back on years from now and say that was the moment when a lot changed. I don't know if we'll look back, hopefully, and say it changed for the better, but certainly we can say it was a period of great change. Yeah.
Well, I'll be brief because you may want to ask Vivek and Kristin to sum up as well. So what I would say is this pandemic has had remarkable effects. Sometimes in history, there's a moment, a thing, an event that changes everything. I have to say, as I said, I sit on the board of Teacher America. The pandemic has changed education in like all kinds of ways that are almost impossible to understand right now. There's a whole generation of children in underserved communities that are missing out, and how we bring them back and get them back in, I just don't know yet. And I think this is one of those incredible sort of step function change in how we think about things. I think it redefines the role of the CEO. I think it redefines the role of the company and the corporation, and how we think about employees and the flexibility and how we attract and keep those folks in a world that is not as connected, I think, in the way that humans are used to connecting. And again, this may be, I'm laughing, Kristin says she's old. I'm really, much older than you. And I have to say, I think that connectedness of belonging to something, of really having great friends. My best friends I met at work over the last 40 years. And I don't know if that's still the truth. That's the case. If you're on Zoom all day long, or your best friends, people on Zoom, I don't know.
Yeah.
But I think it's a big moment, David.
I've wondered that as well, because I'm like you. I met some of my closest relationships were made at work. Vivek and Kristin, let me do that. Let me come to both of you for some final thoughts here in terms of what we talked about for the last hour. Vivek?
Well, I could scarcely improve upon what Meg just said. I would just say I do think it's exciting to be at this moment, because I think we'll look back and realize this moment changed a lot, and a lot for the good.
Kristin?
Yeah, I do think it is changed. And I think it's up to all of us as senior leaders and those in this call to make sure that it is for the good and that we continue to build off. I think people's are open to doing things in such different ways, and we can shape that in ways that drive well-being for colleagues and a better world to live in, or we don't. And I think that this is the moment to make sure that it happens for the good.
Well, I want to thank all three of you deeply for what I thought was a great conversation and for your willingness to engage for this last hour in it, and obviously for helping out Tufts University. Vivek, you got to help out a little bit. You know, you're an alum, but Megan, Kristin, you certainly didn't have to, and I very much appreciate it, and I know that our audience does as well. Before we go, I do want to also recognize Tufts students out there, hopefully working tirelessly to land a summer internship or perhaps a full-time job in the financial services industry, perhaps, because that's what we are here to help you do. I want to thank so many of our Tufts alums who have helped so many of those students secure employment opportunities. The world is, as you heard, it's slowly getting back to something that might approximate normal. And there's still some steep challenges out there. We know that in terms of finishing your education and competing in the job market. I'm a member of the Tufts Financial Network. There are many others. Get involved if you need to. Come to us. We'll do what we can to help you. Certainly the university will as well. And again, thank you to our panelists, all of you for joining us. I'll sign off for now. David Faber. Enjoy the rest of your evening, everybody.
Thank you, David.
Thanks.
Thanks, David.